This is Miller Philosopher. I was watching the Nerd of the Rings interview with Viggo Mortensen recently, which was very good, and I will leave a link to that below. And when asked about what it would take to have him rejoin the franchise, Viggo replied that it would have to maintain the themes of what Tolkien was quote-unquote trying to say. The look and feel of it has to be right, even though elements were cut out for the movies to be made. And for me, this brought up an interesting question in my head. What is Tolkien and what is Tolkienian? Basically, what is defined as anything in relation to JRR Tolkien or his works. This is an interesting question to me because I feel it's a question that all the debates and love for Tolkien's works that have been going around for the last few years have more or less been dancing around without actually saying it. And I think this has been going on since Fellowship of the Ring came out back in 2001. But I also think this has gradually become more intense and looking for more of a hard definition as the years have gone by with each new adaptation that has come to life. It goes without saying that plenty of fans have made their opinions known about what is truly Tolkien or who is a quote-unquote real Tolkien fan. But if I may be so bold, I think a lot of these opinions are a mix of bias and truth. Even when I went to some of the letters of Tolkien, many written after his books have been published, and also went to his more recent publications over the last decade as well, opinions still seem to vary. It's as the old saying goes, art is in the eye of the beholder. Every person looks at something in its own way and interprets it differently based on their own life experience, beliefs, and yes, even biases. So then, what is Tolkien and what is Tolkienian? And additionally, what is not? A good base to start from is the themes that Tolkien writes about in his books. And there are several, but don't worry, I'm not going to dive too deep into that rabbit hole as far as what those entail. The first one is good and evil and its nuances. This is the most obvious theme that both fans and casuals point out, that Tolkien's stories are about a binary ideology of good and evil, and that this view is very simple, not like today's ideology where we must sympathize with evil to some degree or another to understand where they're coming from and why the villain became a villain. Yes, Rings of Power may have humanized Sauron, so to speak, but also, too, Peter Jackson's movies have made Sauron all into a 10-foot armored mace-wielding fire-eye devil, while the Fellowship still are the heroes, devoid, or at least almost devoid, of any impure thoughts and evil intention. However, this isn't entirely true though. When I take Tolkien's books, The Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings, specifically, as a whole, to me, he makes it quite clear that while there is indeed a final red line that delineates the two, there is also a gray area before that event horizon, a point where evil is not necessarily purely evil or predetermined. Evil has not always been there. It is not anything that starts out that way. That includes Morgoth as well. However, once that horizon is crossed, it must be resisted. Number 2, death and death of the old world. Tolkien was once asked what Lord of the Rings was about, and he says that the simplest answer he could give was that it was about death. In the books, he writes about how while there is still beauty to the natural world that exists in Middle-earth, it was also once even more beautiful and amazing than it is now. But that was now lost forever, or was about to be. The High Elves were leaving Middle-earth, and the remaining elves that stayed were supposed to fade away somehow. The Dwarves were going to become even more secluded than they had been already, until they too all but disappear. Magic, at least is how mortals understood it, was now gone, and the lives and adventures of larger-than-life figures like the Valar, Fëanor, Hurin and his family and the Númenóreans and so on were now just, at best, distant myths known only by a few, and, even more so, held no real importance to the lives of the people alive now. Yet the world itself remembers them and mourns them. Number 3. Magic and Ambiguity. Tolkien doesn't use what a lot of Middle-earth YouTubers call, quote, heavy magic in his works. They're there, but they're also few and far between. Moreover, magic isn't really magic, but is a reference to something seen as supernatural by mortals who can't comprehend the deeper mysteries of Arda and the immortals that inhabit it. It refers to the mystery of those things and the lack of understanding. Yet to those immortals who use it, there's nothing supernatural about it. It's just a natural part of their existence and who they are, just as much as running and breathing are to mortals. Tolkien also felt that there wasn't a need to explain everything because he was often writing from the mortal experience and how they perceive these larger-than-life events and things. Hence, characters like Tom Bombadil are perplexing mysteries who never clarify exactly what their origins are and are frustratingly and deliberately vague. Number 4. Fate and Freewill. This is a big one, and I think it leads to many questions about the moral legitimacy, if you will, of how it operates in the world. That everything was sung into existence by Uru Ilúvatar and the Annuar, and that even when that was corrupted by Melkor and his following, it was allowed to be, and that Uru, who sits outside of time and space, foresaw all of this, or at least most of it, because I would argue that what happened with the Númenóreans was not something that was foreseen. That all the major stories and characters are seemingly bound by fate, and somehow, at the same time, also exercising their own free choices as well. No one is necessarily made to do anything, per se. And fate is arguably the most ambiguous and even controversial theme of Tolkien's Legendarium because it lacks definition as to where its jurisdiction lies and what its limits are. Number 5. The Eucatastrophe. This relates to fate as it refers to the literal 11th hour moment of major events where the eventual victory of evil is overcome somehow by the unseen hand of good. Mystery too exists within this because when that 11th hour is known only to Uru and or whatever power makes that decision. It too is also extremely ambiguous and, as I'll get into later, only seems to really come into play pretty heavily during the late Third Age. Number 6. Myth, not academia. An overarching theme of Tolkien is how his writings are stories, myths, legends, tales of a world that once existed or that could exist alongside ours. It could easily be just as much an ancient history as much as an alternate reality, if you will. Therefore, these stories that are written in a simplistic fashion without any of the postmodern nuances that many of us are used to nowadays. Or as JRR Tolkien famously described, what was Aragorn's tax policies after he became king. There is no real discussion about racism or sexism or anything along those lines, even though there are hints of it in his stories. Tolkien never digs too deep into that. Number 7. Power and the corruption of knowledge. In Tolkien's universe, evil is more often than not more powerful and knowledgeable than good guys. Melkor was the most powerful of the Valar until he gave away too much of his power in corrupting Middle-earth itself. Sauron is ahead of everyone else in Middle-earth by 10 or 12 steps at least, and knows more about the workings of people's minds and how to manipulate them than most people do their own minds. Númenor was the most powerful force in the world before it went full tilt evil, and so much so that Uru himself had to directly intervene and wreck the entire world just to resolve the issue, and so on. Tolkien's writings imply a belief that, while not inherently evil, too much knowledge and power can lead one to overstep the authority that was granted to them, or in other words, they don't stay in their lane. 8. Small versus big. While not always true, by the time of the late Third Age, major events could no longer be decided by who was the stronger or who had the larger army. This was the truth in the past, as made example of by Morgoth and Sauron's victories during the First and Second Ages. However, as the Third Age progressed, this became less and less of a factor, perhaps because evil under Sauron, and the evil legacy of the Numenorians as well, I would argue, had become more insidious rather than just overwhelming. Conquest was no longer just about dominating the physical, but also controlling the mental and spiritual, thus making the choices of the small and the quote-unquote weak more apt to deal with it than the larger powers, who were more likely to overlook such things because they seemed so insignificant, such as the hobbits, for example. And lastly, number 9, the importance of sacrifice. This is an underlying theme throughout all of Tolkien's stories, that to resist evil, it's going to cost the defenders something in return. It could be their lives, it could be their innocence, or even someone's immortality and happiness. But that essentially, ultimate victory always comes with a heavy price tag, because the greater good was at stake. So those are the major elements that I believe that Tolkien writes about in his stories. And I left out one element in particular that I'm sure people are going to notice, that of Tolkien's faith and spirituality. I'll touch on that briefly here. I chose to deliberately leave out Tolkien's faith because, while yes, it was an important underlying theme throughout Lord of the Rings, despite the fact that he hated allegory, so he says, his inspirations in his earlier works also came from other religious sources as well. Even the Silmarillion, all versions of it, reads more like Norse mythology than it does Catholicism. Hell, the War of Wrath is literally Ragnarok. And it's well known that Tolkien was inspired by the fairy stories of Northern Europe and their language, as well as German hero and ancient English stories as well of legendary heroes. Now, you could argue that this is a progression, and that's fair, that Tolkien's faith eventually comes more and more into play as his writings develop. But for me, the fact remains that it was still inconsistent. These were not factors that were playing out all throughout his writings. Those are just facts. So, if these are the themes that Tolkien is writing about, as Viggo says, then how does Tolkienian and adaptations fit into this? How is something supposed to feel like Tolkien? I think that most people get caught up on the surface level of this question, both fans of the books, the movies, and the shows. For many, it would mean just having a hero with a villain to defeat and little to no nuance involved. Good is good and evil is evil. Done. And the stories are carried over detail for detail with no deletions or changes made. For many others, something that is Tolkienian can feel like the details aren't as important as much as what the moral or theme the details we're trying to convey is still carried across. If you remove a character who is responsible for representing a particular theme or idea, make sure that theme or idea is still present in the story, at the very least. And other fans feel that Tolkienian means something more looser, something along the lines of just maintaining the larger general themes of the books while leaving out the smaller, more nuanced others that are deemed as not important or not as relevant today. The theme of hope in, like I said earlier, good and evil, are perhaps the largest, more well-known ones that people can easily pick out. And all the other ones are nice to know, but not really that important for them to enjoy the story. For me, Tolkien is what he wrote in the books. Not so much the letters, as I feel that many of them come across as addendums, things that he still wasn't done with and was still thinking about to maybe add to retcon his own writings at some point before he unfortunately died. But Tolkienian means maintaining an unspoken element in the depiction that isn't as much spoken as much as seen and felt. The Tolkienian feel is making Middle-earth feel other, ancient, alien, while at the same time somehow also still being the same. It means maintaining the motivation that Tolkien implies or writes about in major characters, despite whatever changes are made in adaptations. Smaug is still corrupt and terrifying, yet book readers know that it isn't the same Smaug from the book, but it's enough of him that it still conveys his motivations and character. Thorin is another example as well. Again, not the same as the book character, suffering from familiar mental health issues and looking younger than he's often depicted, yet still conveying the same dwarven stubbornness and heroism and dwarven pride that his character was known for. However, what I think is not Tolkienian or Tolkien is when a book not written by Tolkien or a scene by itself or a movie /show /changes or what have you make fundamental changes to the nature of that person or moment that completely change or alter the theme that Tolkien wrote that this character was supposed to represent. When it starts relying on tropes that we know of today in media to carry the story through instead of trusting the story itself to convey those things. And when it relies too much on how the perception of others watching it affects the bottom line and successfully getting the story across, rather than trusting in the story to do that itself. And I need to say this, I'm not making any implications here. All these criticisms have been leveled at all of the adaptations at one point or another, and could apply to any of them depending on who you talk to. Again, art is in the eye of the beholder. But regardless, that is how I see what is Tolkien and Tolkienian. Let me know your thoughts below, and this is the Miller Philosopher. Take care.